If I were to describe The Blank Wall on a superficial level, I would call it a psychological thriller, which follows a family who become tied to a crime, the murder of a nefarious character, and the desperate attempts of a mother to preserve the reputation of her children. First published in 1947 but re-released by Persephone Books in 2009, The Blank Wall by Elisabeth Sanxay-Holding sits in a genre that's easy to read and grips your attention. Sanxay-Holding in this novel is a master in building tension and suspense, and I really felt my whole body tightening as I felt the metaphorical noose tightening around this family. But this book is so much more than just a classic thriller. This is a fascinating look at intergenerational communication and changing beliefs and ideals, brought to life through a mother's relationship with her children and the ways in which they communicate, or more often than not, don't communicate. We see the misunderstanding of a teenage girl for the way her mother lives her life, and this so eerily reflects my own misunderstandings of my mother at that age. Beatrice, or B, our 17-year-old art school student, just cannot understand how her mother, who is a housewife, lives her life. She doesn't believe that she can understand the world or understand how people work. She wants more than what her mother has. She wants to be out in the world. She wants to live life to the full. Unfortunately, the way in which she does this is by associating with some really bad characters who do not have her best interests at heart, and we follow her mother's desperate attempts to clean up the mess that's being left behind. The book, though, is told from the perspective of the mother, and so on the other hand, what we're seeing is a mother who so perfectly understands what her children need, and yet she fails to meet them in such crucial ways. So often throughout the book, I felt like I wanted to scream at Lucy Holly, that's the mother's character, that she just needs to tell her daughter what is going on and what is happening, because that way she would understand the mess that she's in. But instead, she just continues to make everything as easy as possible for her children, and in so doing perpetuates how spoilt of a brat her child is. Normally I hate novels that are just about miscommunication between characters. I just feel like it would be so much easier if they just told each other what was going on. But in this case, I think it really works as an allegory for this miscommunication between the generations. But this is not just a story about a mother-daughter relationship. There is also a teenage son who is 15, and he's almost of an age to join the army and join his father in the war effort, as this is set during World War II. Largely, we see the son acting in ways which are really judgmental over the mother's actions, but there is a scene in which Lucy can tell that her son is really struggling with the idea that he's about to be sent off to war, that he's coming of age, that the war does not seem to be ending anytime soon. She can see how emotional he is, and yet she fails to respond to that and instead asks him to take his shirt off and change it because the collar is fading. And it's such a missed opportunity, and you can really feel that. It's like a visceral feeling as you're reading that scene. Almost 80 years later, there's still a truth in this novel that applies today, even if the material circumstances of an interwar America are different to what we're facing today. I can't help but read this and be reminded of some research that I did a couple of years ago, looking at the idea of the middle-brow feminine novel in the 1920s to the 1950s. I was carrying out this research as part of a project I was doing on I Capture the Castle by Dodie Smith. And in the book, literally of the same name, the feminine middle-brow novel of the 1920s to the 1950s by Nicola Humble, she discusses the idea that books that were by women about women's spaces, so domestic spaces, could not be considered highbrow literature, regardless of the types of themes that they were working with. However, the category came about because there was this growing feeling that certain novels did not fit within the idea of lowbrow novels, but they could not be, because of this idea of the domestic space, be considered highbrow. Interestingly, Virginia Woolf, who is now considered one of the bastions of highbrow literature, could not be considered highbrow because most of her novels centred the domestic space and women's issues. Regardless of whether you agree with these types of classifications between highbrow, middlebrow, lowbrow, or any other type of classification of literature, they are really interesting ways in which to look at how literature was received at the time that it was being produced. I also find it really interesting in this specific case, this idea of the feminine middlebrow novel, to compare it to things like the Women's Prize for Literature today, which very specifically focuses in on writing by women about women's issues and the things that concern women. And I really feel that if this was written today, or if the Women's Prize for Literature was about then, that this would have been a contender for that prize. So now, coming full circle, let's go back to the superficial, just about the reading experience. Written as a psychological thriller, or as I've seen other people describe it as a noir, it is a fast-paced, intense and supremely easy read. I knocked this out in just a couple of days, and I haven't been able to stop thinking about it since. If there was ever a 5-star book, this is a 5-star book for me.